While working for the Allied Army of the Occupation in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, the American Henry Gerber became enthralled with Hirschfeld's ideas and upon his return to Chicago, founded the Society for Human Rights, the first known but short-lived gay rights organization in the United States. In 1929, while living in Los Angeles, Henry Hay learned of the Society's existence from the partner of one of its former members. 21 years later, Hay co-founded the Mattachine Society, one of the most significant gay advocacy groups in US history.
As you may know, June was designated as Pride Month, in part to commemorate the June 1969 Stonewall Uprising. Since then, Pride Month has been a time for LGBT communities around the world to celebrate. It's also a time of reflection on the work that is remaining to be done to overcome oppression and to secure fundamental human rights. Many countries around the world still fail to recognize LGBT individuals. And why go far? Even under a now LGBT-friendly US presidential administration, many states, American states, maintain and continue to pass laws many consider discriminatory. So how far has the global movement to advance LGBT rights come? How has advocacy changed over the past decades? And where is the movement going now? So here to give us a look at the very first comprehensive book about the international LGBT rights movement, we are joined by Dr. Laura Belmonte, author of The International LGBT Rights Movement, A History. Laura Belmonte is a history professor and dean of the Virginia Tech College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. A specialist in the history of US foreign relations, she is the author of Selling the American Way, US Propaganda and the Cold War, and numerous articles on cultural diplomacy. Dr. Belmonte served on the National Council of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations and the editorial board of its official journal, Diplomatic History. Diplomatic History. From 2009 to 2019, she served on the US State Department's Advisory Committee for Historical Diplomatic Documentation. Dr. Belmonte holds a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Georgia and a master's degree and doctorate from the University of Virginia. So Dr. Belmonte, welcome to World Boston.
Thank you for having me.
So we can go ahead and jump right in.
This could easily be an hour and a half long talk, and I'm not going to do that to you, obviously. So it's going to be a quick run through, and then I'm happy to circle back for any questions. So as of mid-2019, 123 of the 193 member states of the United Nations have legalized consensual same-sex sexual acts. But 68 countries still criminalize such behavior, including 6 that impose the death penalty. 26 countries have legalized same-sex marriage, and 73 have non-discrimination protections for gays and lesbians, but they coexist with 32 nations with so-called morality laws that restrict freedom of expression relating to sexual orientation and gender identity, usually under the guise of protecting youth. Most of these laws are modeled on a June 2013 Russian law, the so-called propaganda law, that banned the promotion of homosexuality and advocacy for LGBT equality. These triumphs and challenges reflect a long arc of transnational LGBT advocacy efforts dating from the mid-19th century to the present day. It's a trajectory that's involved individuals, informal networks, NGOs, and states who have not always worked in concert and who have often met resistance from a similar constellation of actors determined to stop the global movement for LGBT equality. While there is an enormous body of literature documenting gay rights movements in individual countries or regions, the transnational connections among LGBT activists have only recently drawn sustained scholarly attention. My book is the first effort to create a synthetic narrative that traces this long story. I could segue into a brief discussion of homosexual attitudes and attitudes about homosexuality changed dramatically from ancient times to the latter 1700s. There were many societies in the ancient world, including India, China, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, that tolerated homosexual practices, while in the Middle East, homosexual slaves and servants were castrated. With the rise of Christianity and Islam, codes making same-sex sexual activities crimes punishable by death or castration spread throughout Eurasia and into Africa. The legal definition of sodomy varied. Sometimes it was limited to anal penetration of a man to the point of ejaculation, but it did not always include oral sex. But some codes encompassed any non-procreative sexual act, regardless of the gender of the people involved. However, there were a lot of indigenous societies in the Americas, in sub-Saharan Africa, and the South Pacific that accepted same-sex intimacy, and in some cases even celebrated those who defied gender norms. When the French, Spanish, Dutch, and English first settled in North America, virtually all of their colonies outlawed male same-sexual activity and attempted to impose European sexual norms upon indigenous people as a means of civilizing them. In the late 17th century, authorities in London, Paris, and Amsterdam periodically attempted to quash emerging subcultures through surveillance, arrests, and prosecutions. And throughout this era, Catholic and Protestant reformers alike condemned sodomy, sex outside of marriage, masturbation, and oral sex. And those found to have engaged in these behaviors faced harsh penalties, including fines, imprisonment, whipping, stoning, disfigurement, branding, pillorying, dismemberment, execution, and execution followed by dismemberment. But in the 18th century, the Enlightenment triggered another shift in attitudes toward private sexual behavior. In France, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and other philosophers denounced sexual licentiousness and deviant practices like sodomy, adultery, and prostitution, but not on religious grounds. They were bitterly critical of organized religion. The philosophers framed their objections to sexual deviance not in moral terms, but based on the view that sexual vice destabilized social order. In an age of frequent war and increasing economic competition, the philosophers deemed population growth essential to national prosperity and security. But they were critical of non-procreative sexual activities like sodomy, but they were even more critical of the state's harsh treatment of those convicted of sexual deviance. And the Enlightenment's focus on individual rights and freedoms triggered more immediate change elsewhere. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, for example, several states reformed their legal codes and opted to punish sodomy with imprisonment, not death. In revolutionary France, calls for liberalization also yielded major changes in anti-sodomy laws. In 1791, fueled by expansive notions of individual rights and no longer bound by pre-revolutionary codes that fused religion and law, France became the first nation in modern Europe to decriminalize consensual homosexual acts between adults in private. As a part of a larger trend toward eliminating penalties for victimless crimes, the French omitted sodomy from both the 1791 Penal Code and the Code Napoleon, adopted in 1804. These reforms had profound global impact. Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Scandinavia, China, and Japan all adopted similar codes. And though some of these nations temporarily deviated from the French model, virtually none of the countries of the European empires, other than those of the British, ever imposed criminal sanctions specifically on same-sex activities in private. And the divergence between states influenced by the French legal model and states influenced by the British model or Islamic Sharia law continues to shape the global landscape on LGBT rights in ways that resonate even now. Economic as well as political trends had major consequences for people's intimate lives. Industrialization dramatically changed pre-industrial patterns of work and family life across much of Europe and North America. Infusions of job seekers leaving agricultural areas transformed cities from towns to sprawling metropolises. Middle and upper class families adopted a strict separation of work and home, divided along gender lines. Houses were recreated to give privilege to privacy. So sex, breastfeeding, and personal hygiene now occurred behind closed doors. But the divisions between urban and rural, affluent and the working class, domestic servants and their employers also created new spaces for sexual attraction and deviation from expected norms. Despite the era's strong emphasis on marriage and domesticity, intimate friendships between men and women flourished, though scholars disagree about how many of such relationships were sexual. Urban life offered people interested in same-sex liaisons an escape from the close scrutiny of family and the ability to find people with similar inclinations. No one celebrated these newfound freedoms quite like Walt Whitman, who arrived in New York in 1841 and really relished city life. He would walk for hours, cruising men in public parks, the docks, ferries, streetcars. He kept detailed notes of his encounters with men, had a few long-term love affairs, but he was very conflicted about these feelings. And in response, he turned to phrenology, then a trendy fad purporting to explain linkages between the shape of one's head and one's defining mental characteristics. In 1841, Whitman went to leading phrenologist Lorenzo Fowler to get his head read. Fowler concluded that Whitman had two very pronounced traits: emotiveness, sexual love, and adhesiveness, comradeship. Whitman latched on to the concept of adhesiveness as a way to explain his intense attractions to men in a positive way. And no longer conflicted about his feelings, he began to express them openly in his poems. In 1860, Whitman added the Calamus poems to a new edition of Leaves of Grass, originally published 5 years earlier. And these were the poems in which he famously celebrated the manly love of comrades. The poems further incensed critics who found Whitman's work obscene, but they also made Whitman an international hero to same-sex attracted men seeking to define their sexual identity, including the British cultural critic John Addington Symonds, the British Irish playwright Oscar Wilde, and the French author André Gide. In an age of resurgent conservatism, following the European political revolutions of 1848, the increasing visibility of men like Whitman alarmed legal authorities and medical scientists investigating the causes of social deviance. So you see books like the French physician Benedict A. Morel's Treatise on Degenerations appear in 1857, in which he specifically links same-sex attraction to degeneracy. That same year, Ambroise Auguste Tardieu, France's leading forensic medical expert, published Medical Legal Assaults on Decency. He went so far as to claim that he could physically identify men who were pederasts because their anuses and penises had distinctive shapes. And accordingly, he called for the rigorous enforcement of laws against public indecency and the physical inspection of suspected pederasts in order to minimize the destabilizing impact they had on society. And identifying and classifying so-called sexual deviants became a powerful legal and medical weapon against those who defied sexual and gender norms. These attitudes were evident among the authorities ruling British colonies throughout the world. And persuaded of their moral superiority, they imposed legal codes designed to police Native peoples seen as especially prone to vice. And the quintessential example of this laws is the Indian Penal Code of 1860, principally authored by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Its paragraph 377, which you see here, criminalized same-sex behavior in a particularly broad way. Participants in these acts were equally condemned, regardless of whether they assumed the passive or active role, regardless of whether it was consensual, or whether the act occurred in a public or private space. This law was adopted in over 36 British territories across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Paragraph 377 was a blunt instrument that lumped together consensual private same-sex intimacy with violent sexual crimes like rape and pedophilia. Having tacitly abandoned the use of the death penalty for sodomy in 1836, Great Britain officially codified this change in 1861 in the Offenses Against the Person Act, which lessened the penalty for sodomy from execution to imprisonment for 10 years to life. It is in this context in 1862 that the German journalist Karl Heinrich Ulrichs began penning, really critiquing sodomy laws. And he articulated a theory about same-sex attracted men that had transnational ramifications. He drew on the new field of embryology and articulated his third sex theory, in which he posited that earnings, which was one of many terms he coined, had predominantly female personalities, but predominantly male bodies, or vice versa. And he argued that these traits were innate. Therefore, persecution of earnings was unjustified and misguided. And he became a very controversial proponent of decriminalizing sodomy. He would give up his crusade in 1871 when a newly unified Germany adopted paragraph 175, a statute that outlawed an unnatural sex act between persons of the male sex that was not fully repealed until 1994. Although Ulrich failed to secure any legal victories, his advocacy efforts inspired other gay rights pioneers, like the German Jewish physician Magnus Hirschfeld. Early in his medical career, Hirschfeld was haunted by two episodes. The first occurred when he was in medical school, when a man who had been committed on basis of his sexual identity for 30 years was paraded naked in front of his class during a lecture on sexual degeneracy. The second occurred early in his career when he had a patient who was a German military officer who was trying really hard to reconcile his homosexual inclinations with the very masculinist ethos of the German military. On the night before this man was to be married, he shot himself in the head, leaving an anguished note in which he called homosexuality a curse against human nature and the law. And Hirschfeld was devastated. And although he maintained the impartiality of a scientist expected in his era, and thus never disclosed his own homosexuality publicly, he redoubled his efforts to help homosexuals accept themselves. He intensified his studies of homosexuality and eventually wrote a pamphlet calling for the repeal of paragraph 175. While some gay men flocked to his practice and were relieved when he told them they were perfectly healthy, Others feared his calls for legal reforms would draw unwanted attention to them. In 1897, realizing he needed allies, Hirschfeld co-founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the world's first advocacy organization for gay and transgender rights. Adopting the motto through science to justice, SHC called for research to debunk anti-gay bias and started a petition calling for the decriminalization of homosexual conduct. Despite police surveillance, Hirschfeld campaigned vigorously and persuaded the German parliament to debate repealing paragraph 175 in 1898, so in just a year, quite remarkable. Although the effort failed, it catapulted gay rights into German political discourse, and Hirschfeld continued his research. In 1919, he established the Institute for Sexual Science. This is nearly 30 years before Alfred Kinsey founded his famed Institute for Sexual Research in the United States. 20,000 people a year came to ISS for sex education, contraception, STD treatment, and advice on gay and transgender issues. Famous visitors included the American author Christopher Isherwood, the English poet W.H. Auden, the Russian director Sergei Eisenstein. Every German visitor was encouraged to sign a petition calling for the repeal of paragraph 175. In 1921, Hirschfeld organized the first Congress for Sexual Reform, which then inspired the creation of the World League for Sexual Reform, which met 4 different times before it was disbanded with the rise of fascism in Europe. Hirschfeld traveled all over the world. American newspapers dubbed him the Einstein of sex. And it was during one of those international trips that Hirschfeld's work drew the ire of the Nazis. In 1933, while he was out of the country, Nazi stormtroopers ransacked ISS and burned the over 20,000 documents and books in Hirschfeld's library, the largest collection on sexuality in the world at the time. More ominously, they also seized Hirschfeld's client list, and the Gestapo used the information to track down and arrest gay men later sent to the concentration camps. Warned by friends not to return, Hirschfeld fled to France, where he died of a stroke in 1935. During his life, his work inspired transnational organizing efforts. In 1911, after the Dutch government criminalized sex with men under the age of 21, the age of consent for heterosexual relations was 16, activists led by the liberal jurist Jacob Schor and criminal anthropologist Arnold Alatrino founded a Dutch branch of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. This flourished until 1940. This branch ran a library, had publications, released reports aimed at students, lawyers, and physicians, and it only disbanded after the Nazis occupied the Netherlands in 1940. While working for the Allied Army of the Occupation in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, the American Henry Gerber became enthralled with Hirschfeld's ideas, and upon his return to Chicago, founded the Society for Human Rights, the first known but short-lived gay rights organization in the United States. In 1929, while living in Los Angeles, Henry Hay learned of the Society's existence from the partner of one of its former members. 21 years later, Hay co-founded the Mattachine Society, one of the most significant gay advocacy groups in US history. The rise of Nazi Germany and the eruption of World War II brought such transnational exchanges to a temporary halt, but it also unleashed forces with long-ranging ramifications for the international LGBT rights movement. In 1933, the Nazis banned LGBT organizations, clubs, and publications. In 1935, they amended paragraph 175 to outlaw a very broad and ambiguously defined array of interactions between men. Between 1933 and 1945, the Nazis arrested an estimated 100,000 German gay men, sentencing about 50,000 convicted homosexuals to prison terms, including 5 to 15,000 who were sent to concentration camps and singled out for especially harsh treatment, not only by the Nazi guards, but in many cases by their fellow captives. At the same time, courts ordered the castration of hundreds of gay men living under Nazi occupation across Europe. When the war ended, gay concentration camp prisoners were not recognized as victims of Nazi persecution. Instead, the Allied military government of Germany forced some of these men to finish out their prison sentences. In the post-Stonewall era, as stories of gay victims of Nazi oppression were finally revealed, gay activists reclaimed the pink triangle that gay men were forced to wear in the concentration camps, making it a sign of both liberation and survival. While World War II unleashed vicious anti-gay repression, it was also a time of discovery and self-realization. In the United States, for example, gays and lesbians found each other in same-sex environments on the home front and in the armed forces. Military psychiatrists persuaded they could identify homosexuals, convinced the Department of War to revise its post-World War I policy of court-martialing and discharging or imprisoning soldiers accused of committing sodomy. So draft boards then began screening suspected homosexual recruits with a number of tests that were easily evaded by gay men and women motivated to serve their nation. Some of these tests were things like, look at your nails. And if you did it this way, it was presumed you were straight. If you did it this way, it was presumed you were gay. Obviously, these were not foolproof. And so many gays and lesbians were successful in concealing their identities once on active duty. But some were discovered, and some of those were then given what was called a blue discharge because of the paper it was printed on. Irrespective of the color of the paper, though, virtually every employer in America had a list of the codes that correlated with the reason one might have been dishonorably discharged, and that had tremendous ramifications for one's future employment prospects. And one was also denied benefits under the GI Bill of Rights. Some of the gay and lesbian soldiers expelled from the military chose not to return to unwelcoming hometowns and instead stayed where they had been discharged. And this contributed to the growth of the very vibrant gay communities that still exist in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. But despite wartime Nazi atrocities against homosexuals, sexual minorities were not explicitly included in the new international protections for human rights that arose in the post-war era. Indeed, German occupation authorities and the West German government continued to prosecute men for violating paragraph 175 through the 1960s. Approximately 100,000 men were arrested for indecency before 1969, 59,000 of whom were found guilty. When West German men jailed for such offenses petitioned the newly established European Court of Human Rights, the court dismissed these complaints in 1959 as manifestly ill-founded and said that these laws were justified under the health and morals exemptions of the European Conventions on European Rights. But this hostility also inspired gay rights activists in Europe and the United States to organize. Taking cues from both pre-war sexual reformers and newly emerging discourses and legal frameworks guarding human rights, they began building transnational relationships that provided a critical foundation for today's international LGBT rights movement. After World War II ended, Dutch activists formed a new organization called the Shakespeare Club, later renamed the Dutch Cultural and Recreation Center better known as COC, an organization that still exists. In 1951, consciously modeling Hirschfeld's World League for Sexual Reform, COC organized the first International Congress for Sexual Equality. Advocates from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, West Germany, Great Britain, Italy, France, and Switzerland gathered in Amsterdam. And they were inspired by the articulation of rights to all people without distinction of any kind in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So they sent the United Nations a telegram requesting steps toward the, quote, granting the status of human, social, and legal equality to homosexual minorities throughout the world. They also created the International Committee for Sexual Equality to continue their efforts to connect homophile organizations seeking civil rights in a time fraught with Cold War tensions. Over the next decade, the ICSE linked homophile organizations in Europe and the United States through publications and its international congresses. Its members included the Scandinavian group Verbanden of 1948, the French group Arcadie, the Swiss journal Der Kreis, several German organizations, and the US homophile groups One and the Mattachine Society. Beginning with the Danish All for One Club in 1954 and the US-based Daughters of Bilitis the following year, lesbian organizations also participated, as did individuals who had no official homophile organizational affiliation. And throughout the 50s, advocates gathered each year for congresses and social events. ICSE monitored political and legal developments and distributed information to its international network. So they paid special attention in when the British government founded the Wolfenden Committee in 1954. There had been a number of very high profile arrests of men charged with sodomy. And this went all the way up in the highest echelons of British society. And this government report issued in 1958 called for the decriminalization of homosexual behavior between consenting adults in private. And it rejected the prevailing view at the time that homosexuality was a mental illness. And this was electrifying news throughout the world for other activists seeking legal claims to protect their identity and behavior. It would take the British Parliament another 8 years to pass the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which decriminalized homosexuality for men over the age of 21 in England and Wales. ICSE never truly became global, and it was short-lived. It had a lot of budgetary problems. It was difficult for people to transcend linguistic differences, but it was an incredible mark of resilience and advocacy in a time of great repression around the world, and created an enduring network of transnational advocates. But by the mid-1960s, more militant homophiles were adopting a more confrontational strategy that drew international attention. In early 1965, after Fidel Castro's regime announced its intention to put Cuban homosexuals into forced labor camps as part of a larger campaign promoting revolutionary gender ideals, manual labor, and ideological purity, militants in the US homophile movement seized on Castro's anti-gay policies as a pretext for attacking those of the American government. On April 17th, 1965, just the day after the New York Times announced Castro's plans, Craig Rodwell of New York Mattachine and Jack Nichols of Washington Mattachine quickly organized demonstrations at the United Nations, the Cuban consulate in New York, and the White House. Picketers carried signs reading, "Cuba's government persecutes homosexuals. US government beat them to it." 15 million US homosexuals protest federal treatment, and Russia, Cuba, and the United States unite to persecute homosexuals. These are very powerful rhetoric in an age of heightened Cold War tensions. Over the next several weeks, Washington, D.C. advocates picketed the United States Civil Service Commission, the State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House. In Philadelphia, there were protests on the 4th of July outside Independence Hall. These protests were carried by news outlets all over the world. In 1967, the Philadelphia-based Homosexual Law Reform Society supported Clive Baudelaire, a Canadian citizen and US permanent resident, in his unsuccessful battle against deportation by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which under the provisions of a 1952 law was barred from living in the United States because homosexuality was considered a form of psychopathy, and that made him unfit for US citizenship. In the late 60s, there are a number of important victories for gay and lesbian rights. In Great Britain, East Germany, West Germany, and Canada, political leaders decriminalized consensual same-sex activities. Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau would famously declare, "The state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation." I mentioned Britain's 1967 law. And then in 1969, the Stonewall uprising in New York, which punctuated years of tension between police and LGBT youth and people of color who had long borne the worst of police abuse and been the most vulnerable members of the community, became an international rallying cry for activists around the world who were ready to launch new forms of transnational advocacy, and gay liberation groups quickly arose all over the world. And gay rights became part of a larger context in which women's rights, environmental concerns, disability rights, and racial and ethnic equality became part of global human rights discourse. And the timing was right for more visible and assertive types of international LGBT advocacy. And I will stop here. There's obviously much more to the story.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I invite people to raise their hands. I know that we have a number of questions. I will actually start off with a question which I think you were about to get into. And by the way, this is absolutely fascinating, the amount of historical detail that I think few of us imagined. So in the story to date, we have been hearing a lot about Germany and the Netherlands and the United States, and it's a very sort of developed world narrative. Looking around today, and then maybe even looking forward, do you see new kinds of leadership on LGBT rights coming out of the non-West, or whatever umbrella term we'd like to use?
I think it's important to recognize that there are a number of countries in Latin America who legalized same-sex marriage long before the United States did, and that there has been an alliance between the European North and the global South at the United Nations in many instances, in advocating for changes in human rights law. And sometimes the United States, until pretty recently, actually would find itself in the company of some really repressive countries and opposing these measures at the United Nations. And that really didn't begin to change in a concerted way until the Obama administration.
Thank you, Dr. Belmonte, for such a comprehensive presentation. I had a question regarding, you had a slide up about a code of law in India back in the 1870s, I believe, that was written up by the British.
Right.
So I was wondering, to what extent do you think colonialism has played a role in shaping prevailing attitudes about LGBTQ communities in countries like India or elsewhere, where maybe perhaps they would have been more accepting of these communities?
I think that's an excellent question. And indeed, some of these countries were more accepting before colonialism. India is a good example of that. The long-term ramification of that 1860 law in India throughout the British Empire, that map I showed you at the beginning, a lot of the countries where same-sex consensual sexual activity is still illegal were former British colonies. And when the Indian Supreme Court struck down paragraph 377 in 2018, so really recent change, that has inspired a number of legal challenges in some other former British colonies. Kenya upheld the law, but it was struck down in Botswana. And I think the momentum on those would have continued had it not been for the pandemic, which is really kind of flash frozen any type of international advocacy. But I think that once the world, regains its footing, the movement will begin once again.
To Michael, I think.
Thank you, Mary. Dr. Belmonte, thank you so much for the speech. I'm looking forward to the post-chat with the members of World Boston. Question for you regarding the current administration. I think it was during President Biden's speech to the US State Department where he said in his administration, he doesn't see a bright line between foreign and domestic policy. And he was talking about that in the context of, economic prosperity in the middle class and all of that. When it comes to LGBTQ issues, how do you see that playing out? How can groups, local organizations put pressure on the Biden administration to make sure that that bright line between a domestic policy that is moving forward daily on LGBTQ issues does get reflected in US foreign policy?
I think it's going to be a real challenge given the current razor thin margin in Congress in terms of, for instance, passing the Comprehensive Equality Act, which is kind of not getting much attention right now, but is kind of surreptitiously, there's quite a cluster of groups on the right that are lobbying to stop that. And of course, we've seen the passage in recent weeks of a number of states that are targeting transgender youth with laws that do things like preclude people from seeking hormone treatment prior to the age of 18, or playing on a sports team if you're playing in a team not of the gender at which you were assigned at birth. And the Biden administration, I think, is really at the same time is really recreating a number of the facets of international LGBT advocacy that the Trump administration upended. Getting rid of the international envoy for LGBT equality, Randy Berry, that they phased out any number of envoys that did human rights work. And there's a bill in Congress right now to bar the flying of the rainbow flag in front of US embassies. But I think that one way in which President Biden can absolutely make an impact is very similar to the way that Hillary Clinton and President Obama did. The fact that Hillary Clinton declared that LGBT rights were human rights, that has incredible rhetorical power. Reclaiming the mantle of human rights more broadly after 4 years in which the United States really distanced itself from advocating for human rights, and in many cases obstructed human rights in instances such as the policies at the border with children. So I think that power is really something that really can't be underestimated. But I am also very trepidatious about a case that should come down from the Supreme Court any day now, which is a case emanating from Philadelphia, where a Catholic social service agency is challenging Philadelphia's non-discrimination clause, which includes sexual orientation, because Philadelphia had, they have a requirement that there not be discrimination in social service agencies, and the Catholic group is objecting to the idea that they would place foster children in LGBTQ families. And with the makeup of the Supreme Court having changed under the Trump years, And with it having signaled its willingness in 3 important cases to broaden religious freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment, I'm afraid we might be on a collision course there. And in the face of that, the Biden administration will really have to figure out if there's an appropriate federal legislative response. So we are definitely on some delicate ground. The work never finishes. It moves into different areas. And having been a state activist in Oklahoma for 13 years and founded the group that's the equivalent of mass equality there, the people who are in red states in particular are facing an avalanche of these anti-trans bills this year.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you for your very informative presentation. And just wanted to mention that in our citizen diplomacy work at World Boston, we've had the opportunity to bring international leaders working on this critical human rights efforts in their communities here to engage with our community. So my thoughts immediately go to them. And with your historical perspective on the arc of the fight for human rights for the LGBTQ community, what might be the encouragement you would give international leaders today who are trying to work on legal advocacy efforts?
I think that, we have to be really careful with one of the things with the international movement today that I think is, important to keep in mind is that sometimes the international scrutiny of a repressive anti-gay environment in another country, a great example would be what happened with the Kill the Gays bill in Uganda, is that sometimes that international scrutiny evokes lots of very deeply entrenched anti-colonialist views. And it can also sometimes inspire really brutal crackdowns on local activists. So there really needs to be attention into how the international community can empower local activists rather than entering these communities and doing the work, which can then risk the blowback that homosexuality is Western or colonial or not African or not Asian, whatever the country at hand is. And now in the time of the pandemic, we've seen a spike in autocratic regimes, crackdowns on any number of human rights activities, a great example in Hong Kong. But we've also seen a really intensification of anti-LGBT activity in Poland and Hungary. And so it's putting the EU in a place of, are we going to enforce these provisions that we put in as a requirement for countries that joined the EU after the Cold War? And so I think really abiding by the principles that have been articulated in international human rights law, and really putting teeth in that is something that we really need to think through what that looks like. Are we willing to withdraw an embassy or our diplomats in a country that's anti-gay, impose economic sanctions? And the international community hasn't really gotten that far in the willingness to impose real sanctions yet. I mean, right now, for instance, in Poland, the EU has withdrawn some money for cultural activities, but that's about the most stringent thing they've done so far.
Great, thank you for your time.
Okay, I think we're going to Jim Moore. Hey, go right ahead, Jim. Hi there.
Hi. Well, Laura, thanks very much for all that you taught us or discussed this evening. I'm very impressed. But as a gay man myself, I will tell you that we've come so far away so quickly, and we have to remember that. I was privileged to work under Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State during my career in the State Department, and you're exactly right when she proclaimed that gay rights or LGBT are human rights, and she did a wonderful job with that. But I wanted to ask you specifically that one of the first map I think you showed, it showed the gigantic countries in terms of real estate of the United States, and Argentina stuck out as being white and with limited and uneven protection. We still have further to go, but could you just explain the white there?
Sure. In regard to the, well, I mean, that map is one that's produced annually by the International Lesbian and Gay, the ILGA, which is the world's oldest NGO, first one founded for international LGBT rights advocacy in 1978. This has become a really critical tool that researchers use and update to keep the status of LGBT rights in every country. And it has any number of markers that they use, relationship recognition, rules on adoption, hate crimes legislation, the inheritance rights, divorce rights, transgender rights. And so the not being fully in the embracing category is reflective. Right now there are 29 states who haven't amended their state laws. We have a kind of crazy quilt on rules regarding adoption in some places, even though there is same-sex recognition. And now, as I mentioned, there have been this real backlash on trans rights that's happening. And in Argentina, it's the same sort of thing, is that even if there is relationship recognition, there might not necessarily be employment protections. And so they have about 15 different indexes they use to gauge the progress that they use there.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one last short question from Natalie. So Natalie, go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Belmonte. So I'm wondering specifically about the impacts of the more medical and scientific aspects of the LGBTQ movement. So, on one hand, it's great that the scientific community can combat pseudoscience and, misconceptions. But on the other hand, homosexuality up until recently, and I'm sure still in many places, is classified as a mental illness. So I'm wondering, what do you think are some of the pros and cons of this more medical and scientific approach to the movement, as opposed to what you've mentioned as a more humanitarian approach of LGBTQ rights are human rights?
Well, I think, as Jim said, I mean, that would be a really potent illustration of something that, I mean, even within my lifetime has changed a great deal. It was not till 1974 that the APA removed homosexuality as, among the, mental disorders. And it was not until much later that gender dysphoria was removed from the DSM as a disorder as well. Something that international advocates worked really hard to get the WHO to do. But at the same time, that kind of idea that this is innate behavior as part of your physiology, we still have people. I mean, we've had raids as recently as this year in sub-Saharan Africa, where legal authorities will give forced anal exams to men they arrest because they're determined that they can physically prove that this means that someone has had same-sex intercourse. So it's, using the guise of science doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to result in someone being treated in a humane way. And of course, as was true in much of Europe and the United States earlier, the idea that if something is a disease, well, what are doctors? What do they want to cure it? So people have been subject to electroshock therapy, huge shots of testosterone or estrogen, castration in some cases. And while we don't see that happen very often anywhere in the world anymore, we do still see reparative therapy, the idea that through some sort of psychotherapy, you can, cure the gay this way. And while there are some states that are making that illegal now, that's not the case throughout the world. And then, of course, you add to that religious condemnation of homosexuality, and that can be a really pretty abysmal troika of rationale for anti-gay repression.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I am afraid that we have actually run out of time for this fascinating overview and history that I think most of us were not particularly aware of. So thank you so much, Dr. Belmonte. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you all have a great night.